Imagine a place that could grant you a wish, and not just any wish, but your most deeply held desire. So you go on a very dangerous journey, but when you get to that uncanny place, there's a catch. That is the story of the most philosophical movie ever made, Andrei Tarkovsky's Stalker. And it's not just a film, it's an experience that can transform you. Because this film forces us to travel into the zone itself. The forbidden place where everything is uncanny and not quite right. And it invites us to question everything we think we know about ourselves. Because the movie directly asks us, the audience, what we would truly wish for, as well as whether we should really be wishing for it in the first place. The film was also cursed. Famously, Tarkovsky had to shoot it 3 times through toxic sludge, an earthquake, and the ruins of the Soviet Union. Some even believe that making the film eventually killed the lead actor, the director, and his wife. Despite that, it's a masterpiece, and it's a contender for the greatest film ever made, because Stalker is pure philosophy. It challenges us to think and to confront the chasm between what we are and what we think we should be. So in this video, let's venture into the heart of the zone with me, your honorary stalker, as a philosophical guide. And for a movie as rich and ambiguous in meaning as Stalker, we'll look at 3 fundamentally different philosophical readings of Tarkovsky's masterpiece, which are the materialist interpretation that offers us despair, a religious interpretation that offers us hope, and a political interpretation that shows us a prison, but perhaps offers us the chance of escape. And if I'm feeling cheeky, maybe I'll give you a 4th secret reading too. But just like entering the room at the heart of the zone, you will have to decide which interpretation to believe and to wish for, as well as worrying that your heart might secretly betray you and choose for itself. Let's hope we all make it back alive. So, a movie about a journey to a place, but difficulties arise along the way, and the characters in confronting these difficulties discover something about themselves. They return, but they are not the same. And that's not just the plot of Stalker, or The Wizard of Oz for that matter, but really every film, and every story, and every myth, and really the story of all of our existences, whether it is a journey towards what we desire, or what we want to be, or ultimately, and in the most Heideggerian of senses, towards our own deaths. That, as we'll see, is the power of Stalker. It's almost a universal film. In its ambiguity and its resonance, it could stand in for so much of what life is and how we make sense of it. But it's not a vague film. In fact, it can be incredibly specific. And the zone through which our heroes journey is not any place, but an incredibly specific and twisted place, almost supernatural, almost science fiction, but never quite either. It has incredibly specific rules, but nobody knows them. They seem almost impossible to determine from one moment to the next. And here's your fair warning, spoilers for both the movie and the book it's based on ahead. The movie unravels, really, slowly and intentionally, with something that's almost a joke. 3 men walk into a bar, the 3 protagonists of our film. And their characters are very specific, recognisable archetypes, each with their own nickname. There's the highly logical and yet naively idealistic scientist. He'll be known as the Professor. Then there's the cynical, definitely not idealistic, and somewhat hedonistic writer, who will be known as the Writer. Then there's the man who will act as a guide on their journey, the Stalker. He is the holy fool of this enterprise, something between a pilgrim and a priest, who will lead the other 2 to their destination at what seems like great personal risk and cost, because they're heading into the zone, a forbidden region, cordoned off from the rest of society and surrounded by troops and barbed wire. It's an exceptional and dangerous space. full of rusted tanks and vehicles that have failed to conquer it, and the skeletons of adventurers who have perished trying to navigate its dangers. Our protagonists will be chased, they'll be shot at, and they'll be almost killed in their attempt to enter. And they will be inches from death, or possibly something worse, while they are in the zone. So why do they undertake this perilous journey into this mythical land? Because it's rumoured that somewhere within the zone there is a room. It is an exceptional space within an exceptional space, and it grants wishes. It grants the deepest, most longed after wish that the person entering the room holds dear. Presumably, that's why our characters brave the many dangers of the zone. Maybe not. And before getting to the mythical room, the genie's lamp of the film, they must find their way there, which can be impossible. After a pretty impressive chase scene, we're treated to their long ride into the zone and one of the greatest moments in cinema history.
Они нас не догонят.
Да что вы? Они ее боятся, как огня.
Кого?
And then we're there, in the zone, in colour, just like the Wizard of Oz. And after a short walk, we actually see the mythical room they're trying to reach right at the start of the film, the grand destination. It's there. One could simply walk for a few minutes and have everything the heart desires. But the Stalker tells us.
Здесь не ходят. В зоне вообще прямой путь не самый короткий. Чем дальше, тем меньше риск.
Ну а если напрямик, это что, смертельно?
Ведь вам же сказали, что это опасно.
And that's why they've hired him, to guide them through the zone's traps. Strange things start to happen that slowly impress on our characters the power and the inexplicable nature of the zone. For example, the writer hears a hidden voice which tells him to stop. Or the professor leaves behind his backpack and then goes back, which is impossible. The other characters think he's dead and they carry on until he appears again, sitting on a crumbled wall, eating sandwiches he's packed and sipping from his thermos of coffee with his backpack recovered. This really actually shakes the Stalker. The zone has spared them twice, when otherwise it would have been merciless. There's something uncanny about these companions, something hidden that he'll soon discover. But the strange nature of time and the ebb and flow of the whims of the zone start to affect them. They lie down to rest. They sleep. Perhaps they dream. Who knows how much time passes? A dog appears, seemingly impervious to the dangers of the zone, but also looking like the incarnation of Anubis, the Egyptian god who guides souls from their tombs into the afterlife. But don't worry, he's a good boy. They proceed into the most dangerous part of the zone, the meat grinder, where the Stalker tells us that passage is not guaranteed and that others have died there. They draw straws for who must go first, and it is the writer. What follows is another of the greatest scenes in cinematic history. And on the other side, the stalker and the professor are stunned to discover the writer, alive and well, and exploring a room that really shouldn't exist. The stalker quickly commands him to leave this mystery alone, that the zone is in such a good mood for this journey, sparing them 3 times already, that they should not tempt fate. They proceed to the room before the room, and boy, do they argue. The writer thinks the stalker set him up, wringing the straws so that he would be the one to be sacrificed because the professor is the stalker's favourite. A telephone rings and the writer automatically answers it before they realise how surreal things have become so close to the room. It's almost like reality is bending around them. They have been slowly revealing their reasons for wishing to enter the room, but here things come to a head and all 3 are exposed. Because during the intensity of the meat grinder, the stalker accidentally reveals to them the true secret of the room, that it does not grant you what you say you wish for when you metaphorically rub the lamp, but rather it grants you what you most deeply wish for. And that the stalker who trained him, Porcupine, great name, discovered this when he entered the room to his peril. Porcupine's brother had just died in the meat grinder, and upon returning from the zone, Porcupine did not discover his brother alive once more. Instead, he became incredibly rich, revealing that his deepest, innermost desire was a banal and shameful one. Deep down, Porcupine valued mere wealth over the life of his brother. And Stalker tells us that Porcupine was found hanged soon after. So, they must enter the room and have their deepest wish granted. The Stalker asks.
Кто хочет первым?
But none of them move. The writer, we've learned, came searching for the room because he feared that his talent is fading, that he's never been truly inspired, but only lucky. He has come to the zone to wish for inspiration. But he doesn't enter the room because he does not know what his deepest desire is. The example of Porcupine has chastened him. He worries that the room is not a magic lamp, but a mirror, and that it will reveal that there is nothing inside of him, that anything he could wish for will not make him happy. The professor then reveals his secret plan, his Chekhov's backpack, if you will, because he's bought a bomb and he wants to blow the room to smithereens. He fears the do-gooder dictators the stalker may accidentally bring into the zone and inflict on the world, who will alter everything to fit their own particular vision of how things should be. Although perhaps this says more about the professor than a genuine risk of this actually happening. But the professor struggles with the stalker and eventually the other 2 persuade him to desist. The stalker thinks the professor is wrong, and he argues that the room is a miracle, a last chance, that the zone only lets through those most desperate, who have lost hope and who need the room the most. The zone is a test the little dictators could never pass and which would consume them. Only the worthy may enter the room, and that in destroying the room, the professor would destroy all hope. They all relent, seemingly more from tiredness than from being convinced one way or another. And the stalker reveals that he cannot enter the room. He is the stalker. It is forbidden within the zone. And despite all of the wretched things in his life, the danger of returning to the zone, his afflicted daughter, their poverty, the stalker has no desire to enter. He relishes his role as a shepherd of the hopeless, as a custodian of the zone. He asks nothing more than people believe in the dark uncertainty of the zone and the possibility of its hope. We finally see the room in a film that has not 1, not 2, but 3 of the greatest moments in cinema. And then we're back at the bar. All three adventurers have returned safely with a good boy in tow. The stalker's wife comes to get him, and he goes home wearily, complaining about how these penitents try his soul. But we all know he's going to return to the zone again. In the last scene of the film, the stalker's daughter stops reading and stares at the abandoned glasses on the table in boredom. A train goes by. The glasses move. And we are left with a mystery. And we stumble back into the world of our alarm clocks, bills, meetings, dirty dishes, and God knows what else, having ourselves just visited the zone, which almost seems to have a character of its own. And while that's said of a lot of movies, you know, the cliche that the setting is the third character, etc., Stalker is one of those few films to challenge the viewer with its setting, to make us ask whether this strange place truly does have a character, or whether we project a character onto the zone and we humanize it in order to deal with its terror, with its alienness, and with its ultimately inhuman indifference to us. The film seems to have no genre or to transcend genre. Is it science fiction? Is it horror? Is it a religious film? Is it a political film? Tarkovsky had made a science fiction film previously, Solaris, based on the sci-fi novel by Stanislaw Lem, but he felt it was flawed, that it didn't live up to what it could have been because it was too explicitly science fiction. It almost let the audience off the hook by being about the future and therefore not being the audience's problem quite yet. Stalker does not let the audience off the hook. It could have happened 50 years ago. It could be happening today. It could happen in 50 years' time. The universality and the ambiguity is built into the name of the setting itself, which could be a war zone, or an occupied zone, or an administrative demarcation zone, or a sacred and holy zone. It's simultaneously all of them and none of them. And there are hints of each scattered throughout the film. But what does it mean? And how is it philosophical? So let's go through three philosophical readings of the film: a materialist interpretation, a religious interpretation, and a political interpretation. And you can decide which one best fits your own journey into the zone. So first, let's turn to the philosophical realist or the materialist reading of Stalker. And what do I mean about realism or materialist approaches? Well, in philosophy, these are usually attempts to exclude all the messy human stuff from our analyses. Anything that can be thought of as subjective or dependent on human minds or reliant on unscientific concepts. Instead, realism and materialism try to stick to the facts and work in a rigorous logical or scientific method or manner. But as we'll see, they don't always succeed. And Stalker is based on a pretty hardcore logical sci-fi novel. That book was Roadside Picnic, written by Arkady and Boris Strugatsky in 1971 and published after heavy Soviet censorship. It is an absolute banger of a book. I highly recommend reading it, and it'll actually be the subject of our inaugural philosophical book club next episode. But the Strugatsky brothers also collaborated with Tarkovsky on the script of Stalker. And so as a result, while they're almost completely different works of art with very different feels, they're also kind of exactly the same. It's hard to explain. The best I can put it is that they feel like two different characters with very different worldviews approaching the same zone. Rather like the book is the professor's view of the zone, and the film, in the second interpretation we'll talk about next, is kind of the stalker's view of the zone. So although Tarkovsky stripped away a lot of the outward signs of the book and its sci-fi genre, they still lurk in strange places within Tarkovsky's zone, and sometimes it even provides pivotal information which can potentially change your whole view of the film. One of those bits of pivotal information is that it provides an explicit explanation for what the zone actually is and why it was created. The how is stated right up front in the book in a televised interview with the fictional Nobel Prize winner Dr. Valentine Pillman. The zones, because there are several of them across the face of the planet, were created by an alien visitation. But human society has no idea who these aliens were and knows nothing about their spacecraft or their technologies because the aliens basically immediately left without contacting humanity. What they did leave behind were the strange dangers and the rubbish of the zones. Humanity didn't figure into their plans at all, and now we spend our time picking over their discarded space junk. So this how of the zone is potentially consistent with the film too. Mosfilm actually forced Tarkovsky to place a caption at the beginning of the film to explain the setting, and which suggests that the zone was potentially created by, quote, a meteorite or a visitation from outer space. But you get the sense that Tarkovsky really wanted the zone to have no explanation at all, to be akin to a miracle or even a miraculous visitation. In the book, we get a stunning chapter which breaks from the point of view of the Stalker, the protagonist in Strugatsky's narrative as well, and which listens in on a drunk Dr. Pillman confessing his secret theory of the zone to a colleague. He says, quote, a picnic. Picture a forest, a country road, a meadow. A car drives off the country road into the meadow. In the morning, they leave. The animals, birds and insects that watched in horror through the long night creep out from their hiding places. And what do they see? Gas and oil spilled on the grass, apple cores, candy wrappers, charred remains of the campfire, cans, bottles, faded flowers picked in another meadow. I see a roadside picnic, precisely a roadside picnic on some road in the cosmos, and you ask if they will come back. It's a great scene in a great book, and it gives the novel its seemingly jarring title, Roadside Picnic. But at the core of it, that's it. The zone is an accidental gift from an indifferent universe, and we may never have the ability to fathom it. In the book, the scientists at the Institute and the stalkers who smuggle out the artifacts of the zone essentially spend their time interrogating the mysterious powerful objects that are the equivalent of empty alien beer cans and junk. Understanding them even a little bit might revolutionize human civilization, but we don't have the tools or the concepts to come even close to understanding them. What fills the gap, both in the book and in the film, are vague analogies or names for mysterious things and superstitions. Even the professor succumbs to superstition when he attempts to explain the zone.
Хороших она пропускает, а плохим отрывает головы.
Не знаю, не уверен. Мне так кажется, что пропускает на тех, у кого...
The indifference of the universe to the things we hold sacred makes us look into the dark heart of what we know and how we know it. It forces us to confront the elements in our thinking that philosophers call folk philosophy. Now, this is a bit of a diss in philosophy. To have your ideas described as folk philosophy is to say that you lack sufficient knowledge, or you lack the tools or the rigour of thought to really crack the problem. Instead, you're attributing meaning to things you don't fully understand and reaching for superstition, like spirits or mystical forces, to fill the gaps in your explanation. Most significantly, folk philosophy is seen as unscientific. It's usually a substitute for when we don't have anything better with which to understand what is happening in the world around us. And it seems, in at least this reading of the film, to be the exact tool for which our heroes reach. But all that might just be projection. When the Stalker says that the zone shifts and changes depending on who's in it, he might just be confessing to his ignorance. It might seem like that because the projections of the people who enter it are all they have to guide them. He freely admits that nobody knows what the zone is like when nobody's in it, and perhaps the same could be said of an indifferent universe without humanity. But there are several philosophies that try to make this indifferent, objective, and inhuman view work. Philosophies like eliminative materialism or eliminativism, determinism, and philosophical realism. All of these attempt to remove the messy human elements for our thinking and just stick to the scientific facts, just like the professor tries to, but fails, within the zone. Now, eliminativism is better known in philosophy of mind, and it claims that our ordinary common sense understanding of the mind is just deeply wrong. Just because we seem to experience mental states or certain emotions or think in images doesn't mean this is how it actually works. And eliminativists think that eventually science will mature to a point where it can explain all experience and consciousness in purely scientific terms, possibly as pure physics, without needing to resort to folk explanations. Eventually, human experience will be taken out of the science completely as it advances and its explanations get more rigorous and sophisticated. The grandfather of eliminativism, Wilfrid Sellars, even came up with a useful thought experiment called the myth of Jones, which posits a being that has no internal thoughts or mental states at all. And the myth myth, as he tells it, often starts to sound like it should have been included somewhere in Stalker. Philosophical realists will often embrace determinism too. The idea that if everything is just fundamental physics at the bottom of it, then everything that ever happens is determined in the tiny moments following the Big Bang. And ultimately, philosophical realists think that there will be a mind-independent explanation of everything, a unified field theory of all sciences which will explain away the humanities. Ray Brazier, a leading philosophical realist, even says that, quote, nihilism is not an existential quandary, but a speculative opportunity. And the materialist reading of Stalker gives us a taste of that indifferent world because it is uncanny. The adventurers obey all of these arbitrary rules. They often navigate invisible forces, but often they're just standing in a field. There's a complete absurdity to it. They have no idea what is going on, and they have no way to measure or to fathom what they, and us as the audience, can't see. The writer even makes fun of the professor and claims he wants to, quote, measure the immeasurable. I think Tarkovsky genuinely wants us to be able to read the film in this hardcore realist way, and in our minds challenge what we see on the screen. Tarkovsky intentionally doesn't deploy fancy special effects to try and convince us of the supernatural powers of the zone. At one point in the film, the writer turns to the professor and asks,
Да и вообще, кто вам рассказал про зону, про дикобраза, про комнату эту? Он.
And we believe it for that reason too, because the characters tell us in their actions and their faces, in the way they slowly come to believe the strange reality and the rules of the zone. But the philosophical realists watching the film could easily accuse us of complete projection, that we are engaging in folk philosophy to try and explain something that someday a sufficiently sophisticated science will answer. The aliens obviously have this, after all, if you go for that reading. But I have an objection to this kind of philosophizing, as do quite a few other philosophers too. So here's the counter-argument to the materialist reading of the zone. Because science, at least at the very way we conduct it, depends on a little faith too, a tiny little bit of irrational belief. That's its dirty secret, and every philosopher kind of knows it too, because science, and indeed most forms of human knowledge, depend on something called the principle of sufficient reason, that for every effect there is a cause and that cause can explain it. But this is a metaphysical principle, and in philosophy there's actually no rock-solid proof that the principle of sufficient reason is the case. It's simply so important to everything we know that we assume it can't be wrong. But the philosopher David Hume actually demolishes a related idea, causation, in his own famous work. And according to Karl Popper, science works precisely because all of its hypotheses could ultimately be refuted, found to be wrong, in other words, and revised. So no claim in itself can be irrefutable, like the principle of sufficient reason. For the eliminativist, the philosophical realist, the professor, and the scientists beavering away at the Institute, there has to be a fundamental faith that although they can't explain the nature of the zone now, with sufficient progress, funding, revision to their ideas, with the right tools and understanding, one day they will be able to explain the zone. And whether it's in the film, the book, or elsewhere, believing that takes a lot of faith. In making the film, Tarkovsky asks the question, but what if one day we simply find something that's inexplicable? And for me, while I like this reading because it challenges you to think and it gives a real mystery to the film, it falls apart when we get to Martin Heidegger. Because Heidegger makes a killer philosophical point early on in his work, Being and Time. He points out that there will never be an objective, independent answer to things. Because to get an answer, you have to ask a question. And the asking of that question is always rooted in our limited human understanding. We always ask the question in a way that the answer will make sense to us, which is already changing what the answer may be, no matter how scientific. And further, we ask the question because we care about having it answered. And that care is already tied up in our projects, the things we desire to know, what we want, all that messy human stuff that influences the asking of the question and therefore the answer. Philosophers of science like Canguilhem, Bachelard and Foucault spend their entire body of work showing how the sciences cannot be separated from the questions of value and the social context that demands their answers. So when the Stalker implies that the zone reshapes itself in relation to whomever enters it, I think he's saying something profound about the scientific method and any mode of human searching. It is done by humans, and it is not an independent or objective exercise. It is shaped by them. How they understand the nature of the zone is deeply shaped by the baggage each adventurer brings into it, as we shall see. It may all be a projection, but unfortunately, in the face of the incomprehensible, that's all we have. That, for me, is the first reading of this deeply philosophical film. Hopefully now you'll see how terrifyingly deep it goes. Well, strap yourself in, because that was just the easy materialist reading of the film. Next up, we have the religious. Because doesn't even the strict roadside picnic reading of the film kind of stray close to the religious? We've already mentioned faith in relation to science. And what is the difference between, as Arthur C. Clarke has pointed out among others, aliens so powerful they're like gods, and a good old-fashioned Old Testament God? They both concern forces we may never fathom. Perhaps the only difference is in the attitude that we adopt towards them, whether that be the attitude of the professor, who hopes someday everything will be explained, or that of the stalker, who has faith that the zone ultimately makes sense and that his pilgrimage through it will be successful. Tarkovsky struggled with these ideas himself. His diary entry for Christmas Day in 1974 reads, "At the moment I can see a film version of something by the Strugatsky brothers as being totally harmonious in form, unbroken detailed action but balanced by a religious action, entirely on the plane of ideas, almost transcendental, absurd, absolute." Because there's religious imagery everywhere throughout this film. There's electricity poles that look like crosses, a crown of thorns, baptisms in giant pools of water, a dog that resembles an Egyptian god. He's a good boy. Quotes from Revelation, for goodness sake. I mean, Stalker is lousy with religious imagery. It is a Tarkovsky film after all. And Tarkovsky was a man of deep faith, an Eastern Orthodox Christian, but he was not a fanatic. The nature of faith troubled him deeply, and he held it at a time when it was explicitly persecuted in the Soviet Union, even if in some official forms it was tolerated. And the Stalker seems pretty tormented by his faith in the zone too. How can he believe so firmly in that which he cannot see? And why does he seem to constantly be drawn back to this uncanny place? And how does he know the power of the room to grant wishes when he's never experienced it himself? But as Mark Lefanu remarks in the Criterion Collection's introduction to Stalker, it's not a straightforward Christian allegory. There is no Christ-like figure, even though at one point the writer makes himself and wears a crown of thorns, but we'll explain that in a minute. And the Stalker himself is less a Christ who redeems and more an apostle who helps lead the lost and desperate to their potential salvation. But he does not embody it himself. He's much more that classic Russian literary figure of the holy fool, straight out of, Mussorgsky's Boris Godunov or Dostoevsky's The Idiot. Interestingly, Tarkovsky was desperately trying to finance an adaptation of The Idiot throughout the 70s while he was making this film. But also, how is a potentially religious reading of Stalker also philosophical? Well, for that, we need to reach for our old friend Soren Kierkegaard and his terrifying philosophical work, Fear and Trembling. Alistair Hannay, Kierkegaard's English translator and expert, describes him as, quote, a Christian and a scourge on Christianity too, who concluded that, quote, our irritable attempts at clarity may lead only to deeper obscurity. If you're a fan of the channel, you may remember that we've already come across Kierkegaard's work in talking about La Dolce Vita. I mentioned there that Kierkegaard outlined three potential modes of being: the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. And we only really looked at the aesthetic because that was the kind of existence that La Dolce Vita's main character, Marcello, was inhabiting. But in Stalker, conveniently, we have all three modes of existence. You could argue that the writer most clearly represents the aesthetic mode of existence because don't they always, another decadent writer like Marcello? But he literally turns up to the most dangerous journey of his life half drunk, in a fancy car, with a beautiful woman he wants to bring along, and pretty much he wants to keep the party going. He's lost inspiration, and one gets the impression that the writer's wish in The Room would be to gain more fame and to sell millions more books. He lives for today, and he wishes for a tomorrow that will enhance the pleasure of his endless presence. The professor, on the other hand, is a serious man, just like the judge in Kierkegaard's Either Or. He takes everything seriously. He follows the stalker's instructions to the letter. Well, almost. And he generally looks out for what is best for everyone. He bandages the nuts, he retrieves the train car, he bought enough coffee and snacks for everybody, and he offers it to them throughout the film. Even when he deviates from this to blow up the room, he does it to save everyone else from the tyranny of petty dictators. In short, he embodies Kierkegaard's definition of the ethical mode because he always acts from the universal and in the interests of the universal. He's almost always behaving according to a Kantian categorical imperative or the golden rule, do unto others. The Stalker is where things get interesting, because it's hard to describe his existence as anything but religious, and ambiguously so. He believes in the zone, but only insofar as it has miraculous powers to save the hopeless. He does pray, and he seems to believe in God of some sort, but the zone only seems to bring him closer or into personal relationship with some other form of God, what Kierkegaard in Fear and Trembling calls the absolute. And this is not the ethically religious, unquestioning behaviour of a church member who does what the priest says and follows a doctrine he does not think about. These are the actions of what Kierkegaard calls a knight of faith, an individual who leaps beyond the known in an act of faith, an infinite movement in Kierkegaard's language, despite the uncertainty and the cost to themselves. Kierkegaard outlines this most clearly in his strange work, Fear and Trembling, which is a philosophical consideration of the historical figure Kierkegaard thinks most embodies this kind of unknown leap, Abraham, who was called upon to sacrifice his son Isaac by the command of an Old Testament God. A horrific faith that Abraham could have fled or denied, but did not. And by a miracle, at his most hopeless, he was granted his deepest desire, to be both faithful to God and to save his son. And he did so by taking a long journey to the mountain at Moria and undergoing a cruel test. Really, if you told me that Tarkovsky had adapted Stalker from Fear and Trembling rather than from Roadside Picnic, I'd readily believe you. I'll talk about the key concepts and the religious reading of Stalker in a minute, but let's get sidetracked for a second. Because you could say to me, but Drew, how are Stalker and Fear and Trembling parallel tales? Where's the faith and the necessity of sacrifice in Stalker? To which I'd firstly say, why I order? But secondly, here's where I punish your impudence by letting you in on a horrifying secret about the film, which will change how you see it next time. Are you ready for it? Because when they draw straws to see who will go ahead into the meat grinder at the climax of the film, only the Stalker knows that they're drawing straws to see who will die. And when the writer draws the shortest straw and heads into the meat grinder, he is the sacrifice that will allow the others to travel safely through that awful place. Porcupine's brother, we are told, died horribly in the meat grinder. And now I've let you in on this little secret, it suddenly makes sense why Porcupine becomes rich and then kills himself. Not only because he didn't wish deep down to bring his brother back, but because he may have intentionally or unintentionally sacrificed his brother to get to the room in the first place. That is the cost of entry. How do I know all of this? Because it's a critical element at the climax of the Strugatsky brothers' book, Roadside Picnic, where it's revealed that this is the price for making it to the Golden Sphere, the book's version of the room. And in the book, the trapped path that leads to the sphere is called the meat grinder. Given the Strugatsky brothers also adapted the script for Tarkovsky, they must have consciously kept in this title for the final trap. And it makes sense of one of the most powerful images of the film. The writer, after having survived the meat grinder, wearing a crown of thorns, a pretty heavy reference to Christ, which is a little confusing. Because isn't the Stalker the most Christ-like figure in this film? Isn't he the holy fool and the shepherd of men? Well, it's the writer who drew the short straw in the meat grinder, and who is the sacrifice so that the others may proceed to paradise. And just like Christ, the writer does not die. In fact, he is risen. Now, typically for Tarkovsky, these allegories don't match up perfectly. They're far more powerful in their ambiguity. The writer would make for a very cynical Christ, and I don't think he's very likely to ensure anyone's salvation. Yet even these imperfect meanings and metaphors layered over the zone create a kind of deeper religious experience and atmosphere without ever explicitly handing us the answers. It's exactly how Kierkegaard understood the Bible too, not as literal or even as useful metaphors, but rather as a dark mirror full of paradoxes for us to ponder, but also full of traps and potential missteps, just like the zone. For both Tarkovsky and Kierkegaard, faith is worthless if it is certain, if it can be followed blindly and wagered upon and be completely unthinking or contain no angst. True faith, for them, requires a leap, a bandaged nut thrown out in an uncertain direction with no guarantee that the path isn't a dead end. And it's even in the title, Fear and Trembling, which is a reference to St. Paul's biblical injunction to, quote, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, which sounds exactly like what our characters are called upon to do within the zone. But what of the religious resonance of the zone itself? Because Tarkovsky originally wanted to film Stalker at a deserted mine in Tajikistan, back when Stalker was a closer adaptation of Roadside Picnic, and the Stalker himself was a more mercenary and cynical character. It was actually stopped the first time because an earthquake prevented them from filming there, and instead they stumbled upon a wild, lush site of an abandoned power plant just outside of Tallinn in Estonia. And this changes the film dramatically, including indirectly the character of the Stalker himself. Because now the zone is a beautiful place, almost like an overgrown Garden of Eden, and the Stalker is almost overwhelmed by his return. You get the impression that he feels this way every time he comes back. He is like an atom allowed to return to the briefest moment before the fall. But as Geoff Dyer points out in this miserable little book on the film, which I do not recommend you read because most of it is about how he lost a backpack once and still really misses it, and if he ever went to the room, he'd wish for 1,000,000 backpacks. The return is uncanny, unheimlich in Heidegger's terminology, and deadly. What is also key about the zone is doubt. Because as I've mentioned and is highlighted in the film, everything we know about the zone is either told to us by the Stalker or relayed secondhand by the Professor. In the book, we actually see the deadliness of the zone and the supernatural nature of the zone in action in the first chapter. But in the film, no such luck. Instead, to borrow a phrase, in the film, we want to believe. But we have doubts, as do our adventurers. Even when it comes to the room, Tarkovsky said later that the audience should doubt whether the room is even real. And the only way to find out is to enter it for yourself. It cannot be done by another. And for Kierkegaard, doubt and uncertainty are central to real faith. But they're also exactly what we've lost in the institutions of religion, who guarantee the certainty of their doctrines and its truth to their parishioners. Not so in the zone, though. And while he's in his rocking chair shaking his cane at you damned kids, Kierkegaard also says that, quote, in the old days, end quote, it took a lifetime and many bitter experiences to come by real faith too. The zone makes this pretty explicit. Our hero's whole experience of it is tense and difficult. It seems like they come face to face with death several times, and they go from mildly skeptical at the start of the film to firm believers at the end, so much so that they can't even bring themselves to enter the room, now that they have faith that it is real and it will grant their deepest wish. But they do so at risk to their lives. Kierkegaard also argues in Fear and Trembling, and throughout his work really, that the deepest truths are found not by reasoning your way with certainty into them, but through confronting paradox. He spends so much time on the example of Abraham because he considers Abraham a murderer, willing to sacrifice his son, and worse, the most reluctant of murderers who could have turned back at any point during his journey, just as the writer and the professor threatened to do in the middle of theirs. But Abraham doesn't. His faith is so great that God will not betray him that he continues to the very end. And Kierkegaard marvels at this faith in the face of the most radical uncertainty. It's the same kind of faith we find in the Stalker, who is convinced that if he obeys the zone, he will not be betrayed, despite the fact that he cannot know this for certain. For this reason, he resembles what Kierkegaard calls the knight of faith. And it's worth considering this idea for a minute. Because, Kierkegaard thinks, when the knight of the faith does something exceptional based only on the call of their conscience, what they think is right, and their faith alone, it's almost unfathomable. It's what he calls a teleological suspension of the ethical, because it cuts across all of the other modes of being. The knight of faith rejects a childish living for today, the aesthetic existence, taking a particular case-by-case approach to every dilemma. But he also rejects the universal ethical approach to that dilemma, which is a safe, secure, certain answer. Instead, the knight of faith chooses to break all of the rules for something greater, to have an individual relationship with the absolute, in Kierkegaard's terms, which Kierkegaard thinks should be terrifying. Obviously, Kierkegaard doesn't think this is easy. He writes, "And yet the whole earthly form he presents is a new creation on the strength of the absurd. He resigned everything infinitely and then took everything back on the strength of the absurd. He is continually making the movement of infinity, but he makes it with such accuracy and poise that he is continually getting finitude out of it, and not for a second would one suspect anything else." Kierkegaard's text here is a little dense, but what he means is that the knight of faith gives up that thing which he desires most deeply, hoping that a miracle will grant it back to him. This infinite resignation, or giving up, is the hard path. And we see the Stalker do this. He gives up a normal life. He gives up time with family he loves. He risks prison because he believes it is his purpose to lead the desperate into the zone to be saved. But the Stalker himself is amongst the most desperate. You can tell that if he could save his daughter, he would do so in a minute. So why does he not enter the room and wish for it? I think it's because of Kierkegaard's concept of infinite resignation. Stalkers are not allowed into the room, but he gives up the very thing that he would wish for, absurdly hoping that in some way it will be granted to him anyway. It's also why he can't lead his wife there, for her to wish for it. He knows that she is not the most desperate and hopeless. She has him and she has her daughter. And in the final scene of Stalker, it's no mistake that Tarkovsky focuses on the Stalker's daughter and her possible powers, because it's possible that the Stalker has been granted what he most deeply desires. He just doesn't know it yet, and just not in the form that he might have expected. That's all a lot. And if I had to sum up the film and the philosophically religious reading of the film, it would be to use a word that turns up again and again whenever people talk about Stalker: miracle, чудо. It's in the film.
Если это даже и чудо, это часть природы, а значит, надежда в каком-то смысле.
It's in interviews about the film.
Надо было сотворить маленькое чудо в каждый раз, для того, чтобы сделать этот сталкер. Надо было сделать невозможное.
And it appears again and again in writing about the film. But what is a miracle? In introducing Fear and Trembling, Alistair Hannay even quotes David Hume's witticism on Christianity and miracles, quote, "The Christian religion not only was at first attended by miracles, but even to this day cannot be believed by any rational person without one." Which, good one, Hume. But Hannay also points out that Kierkegaard is arguing the reverse, that having faith and a religious experience of the world requires you to embrace an insoluble paradox, miracles, which are miracles precisely because they're impossible. And yet impossibility seems to be the very nature of the zone. The room grants miracles. And that, perhaps, is why none of the characters can enter it. It is too painful. Because think about the way the existentialist author Albert Camus tells the myth of Sisyphus, for example. Life is absurd, and we push a boulder up a hill, but it will never reach the top. We just have to be happy with the effort of pushing the boulder and knowing that we're never going to reach the top. But Kierkegaard's Knight of Faith both accepts that it is impossible to push the boulder to the top and simultaneously hopes and believes that a miracle will come, that they can do it anyway. The room is a miracle because it exists, and it gives hope to the desperate that their impossible wish may be granted. But they must have faith too. And you could also argue that they do not enter the room because in granting their deepest wish, the professor, the writer, the stalker will come face to face with themselves and know themselves for the first time. Or that in standing in the presence of something so omnipotent, they would be standing in the presence of the absolute. And perhaps they might be driven crazy with the knowledge, like a character in a Lovecraft story. Or you could combine all three and say that by entering the room, our heroes would be granted what they most deeply hoped for. They would find the answer, and they would have no reason to keep pushing that boulder up that mountain because the boulder is gone. And then they would ask, and then what? All of those readings are plausible, but our characters never enter the room, so we never find out which one is right. All of those readings could also make up the rich tapestry of a religious reading of Stalker. And the materialist reading, I feel, doesn't undermine the religious reading, but actually makes it possible. Because there is no faith, after all, without doubt. But my favourite religious reading comes from Tarkovsky's wife, Larissa. She thought that there was one final miracle at the end of the film that makes the stalker entering the room unnecessary. And it is the stalker's wife's unconditional love for her husband, which she confesses at the end of the film. Larissa Tarkovsky said, quote, namely that human love alone is, miraculously, proof against the blunt assertion that there is no hope for the world. This is our common and incontrovertibly positive possession. Or, to borrow a quote from somewhere, and now these three remain, faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. So that's the religious reading. But what about the third reading of the film, the political? Well, for me, this reading actually stems from the consequences of Kierkegaard's thought on faith and the teleological suspension of the ethical. He thinks about the fear and the consequences of actually letting people loose to follow their consciences. He writes, there is a fear of letting people loose, a fear that the worst will happen once an individual enjoys carrying on like an individual. Moreover, living as the individual is thought to be the easiest thing of all, and it is the universal that people must be coerced into becoming. I can share neither this fear nor this opinion. In other words, if following one's authentic individual self was easy, everybody would be doing it. But I think we can all see that we live in a society of the opposite, and the battle is actually against stultifying conformity, those who follow the crowd and are offended by those with the courage not to, and who seek every opportunity to stop them. I'd argue that this was on Tarkovsky's mind too while he was developing Stalker, because Tarkovsky's diary also provides a clue as to why he wanted to adapt and film this book in the first place. Marc Lefanu again writes that Tarkovsky strikes up in the pages of his diary a retrospective connection with Solaris, which is one of his earlier films. Using the form of science fiction in his new film, he says, will allow him to broach the topic of a religion legally. He hadn't been able to tackle this subject in The Mirror, another of his films, for all the freedoms that the great film undoubtedly displays. Indeed, Tarkovsky's diary entries bring us towards another reading entirely, the political reading, because another notable feature of Stalker is that it was the last film that Tarkovsky ever made in the Soviet Union. In 1982, he moved to Italy to shoot his next film, Nostalgia, and when Mosfilm cancelled their support for the movie, Tarkovsky vowed never to work in the USSR again, and he never returned. There's also a moment at the start of the film where the man who we will come to know as the Stalker says this.
Господи, тюрьма. Да мне везде тюрьма.
To the Stalker, the world is a prison, and paradoxically, he's only free when he's in the zone. But it chimes strangely with Tarkovsky's own diaries too, who, during the period, constantly dreamed of being in a prison. Marc Le Fanu again describes them. Almost all the dreams recorded by Tarkovsky in the period 1974 to 77 seem to have been about being in prison. In one case, being in prison, escaping, and then wanting to get back into jail again. Quote, "At last, to my joy, I saw the entrance to the prison, which I recognized by the bas-relief emblem of the USSR. I was worried about how I was going to be received, but that was as nothing compared with the horror of being out of prison." I think it's pretty clear at this point Tarkovsky was explicitly thinking of the Soviet Union as a prison, and as the Strugatsky brothers kind of did too. In one of the introductions to Roadside Picnic, Boris Strugatsky actually writes with still burning fury about the censorship process and the hard road the book had to publication. It was mangled, and at every turn the Strugatskys were forced to compromise to please the censors of the Soviet Union. The same was true of Tarkovsky in getting a film made. Being an artist in the Soviet Union and bringing your film to life was rather like navigating the zone. There was no direct route. You had to move through the detours and roundabout paths, avoiding traps and pitfalls along the way. By the 1970s, these traps were unlikely to lead to death, for example, but they could lead to exile or to being barred from practicing your calling entirely. And as a historian of the Soviet Union, Anne Applebaum, points out, the world outside the barbed wire was not referred to as freedom, but as the Bolshaya Zona, the big prison zone, larger and less deadly than the small zone of the camp, but no more human and certainly no more humane. Life within the slowly crumbling Soviet Union had become, according to Tony Judt, a way of life to be endured. Geoff Dyer even points out that the image of the Gulag is everywhere in Stalker, from his close-cut hair, reminiscent of the prisoners or Zek, to the barbed wire and the soldiers. Even the term meat grinder is also a prisoner's term for the procedures of the Soviet repressive system itself. But is the zone itself a man-made zone? Because it seems the opposite. It seems like a repressive system that has sprung up around it to contain the zone and ensure, unsuccessfully, that no one is able to enter. So let's consider both sides of this coin, because there is an argument for the zone in Stalker being a man-made zone, a prison and potentially a hell of our own creation. Tarkovsky originally wanted to film around a desolate mine site in Tajikistan because he envisioned the zone as being created not by aliens visiting, but by the use of nuclear weapons on a grand scale. Now, it's a bit of a myth that using nuclear weapons would leave behind huge permanent sites of radiation. Actually, nuclear weapons use a small amount of highly enriched material, and it's the presence of huge amounts of radioactive material that would lead to a fallout series like radiation and mutation. Sorry, fallout. But there is another kind of accident that would leave behind the kind of devastation and alien landscape that Tarkovsky envisioned, the meltdown of a nuclear power plant. That's because they use a relatively huge amount of both radioactive fuel and irradiated materials. And 7 years later, that's exactly what happened with the destruction of reactor number 4 in the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, leading the Soviet authorities to create a zone of exclusion. And in a weird coincidence, the location the professor calls in the film is bunker number 4. Now, of course, Tarkovsky isn't psychic. He didn't predict Chernobyl. And just about everybody was thinking and writing about the dangers of nuclear weapons in the 1970s. Tarkovsky's first cinematographer, Georgy Rerberg, said that, quote, nature prevented him from making it a zone that looked like a nuclear disaster. Instead, Stalker became something else. But what Tarkovsky knew is that humans and the monolithic systems we all too often construct frequently generate these kinds of inhuman spaces, these zones. And not just nuclear ones, but no man's lands, war zones, testing areas, or forbidden places. We can't seem to help it. After the Second World War, Max Frisch wrote of the devastated and abandoned zones in Eastern Europe that this is what exists, the grass growing in the houses, the dandelions in the churches, and suddenly one can imagine how it might all continue to grow, how a forest might creep over our cities, slowly, inexorably, thriving unaided by human hands, a silence of thistles and moss, an earth without history, only the twittering of birds, spring, summer, and autumn, the breathing of which there is no one to count anymore. The zone of Stalker looks exactly like this. It's haunting. And it's what the worst of our nature and our systems can sometimes accomplish. But there's a strange inversion that happens in the film, because the stalker isn't returning to a prison when he re-enters the zone. He seems finally happy and finally free. He says,
Ну вот, мы дома.
for him, it doesn't matter whether the zone is man-made or not. In a strange way, it's freeing. And that's the flip side of the coin. Why it's surrounded by soldiers and barbed wire. Because as Kierkegaard noted, every institution and system fears letting people loose. In fact, they're often created to prevent it. In the book, the Institute grows up and eventually surrounds the zone for this very reason, to capture and contain its freedom. We get the impression that this is why the zone is closed off in the film too. It potentially grants wishes, after all, and such wishes should be controlled by the state. Even if the state can make no use of those wishes at all and would never trust a single individual to resist such a temptation. It reminds me deeply of a Kafka story called Before the Law, which he later included in his book The Trial. A peasant from the countryside comes to seek justice, but at the open gate leading into presumably the courthouse, although we're never actually told that, a splendidly dressed and sophisticated doorman stops him and says that he's forbidden to enter. Kafka writes, since the gate leading to the law stands open as always, and the doorkeeper steps aside, the man bends down to look through the gateway into the interior. When the doorkeeper sees this, he laughs and says, if it tempts you so, then try entering, despite my prohibition. But mark, I am powerful, and I am only the lowest doorkeeper. In hall after hall stand other doorkeepers, each more powerful than the last. Suitably cowed, the poor man waits and waits for the rest of his life, sitting on a stool outside of the gate, looked down upon by the snooty doorman. And just before he passes away, the peasant asks the doorman, surely everyone strives to reach the law. How does it happen that for all these many years, no one except me has ever asked for admittance? The doorkeeper recognizes that the man is at his end, and in order to reach his failing ears, he raises his voice and bellows at him, no one else could ever have been admitted here, since this entrance was intended for you alone. Now I am going to close it. The philosopher Walter Benjamin once claimed that Kafka took all conceivable precautions against the interpretation of his writings, but that hasn't stopped dozens of philosophers trying to divine the meaning of this tale, including Adorno, Deleuze, Agamben, Derrida, and me in one pretty average graduate essay. The ongoing debate about the tale's meaning between Jacques Derrida and Giorgio Agamben is a notable example, particularly because Agamben is very much a scholar of zones of exclusion and states of exception. But what interests me is the relationship between the truth or law or freedom, whatever the final glorious room is that is represented within this tale, and the system that grows up around it to gatekeep us from its threatening freedoms. To me, this story screams of being a kindred spirit to the zone and Stalker. Michel Foucault points out that power often cloaks itself in mysticism or ritual, or in legalese or bureaucracy, but the point is the same, to keep the peasant out and to reserve its power for itself. But Foucault also highlights that this creates sites of resistance, zones that a stalker and a few companions can sneak into, can defy, can take up the very tools that are being used to oppress them or kept from them. There is danger in these zones because they cut both ways. And we can love the system too, feel passionately attached to it because it gave us possibilities and made us what we are. Tarkovsky himself dreamed of escaping, but as soon as he did, he desperately wished to be in prison again. And when he finally left the USSR, he dreamed from afar of his homeland. Those who control the zone cannot wish for their own freedom, but they can exercise control over the freedom of others, and for that reason feel that they possess the power of the zone even when they don't. Tarkovsky had his own encounter with the room. He figuratively entered it, if you will. After making his masterpiece, The Mirror, Tarkovsky actually had a hard time getting his films approved for production. He wanted to film an adaptation of Dostoevsky's The Idiot and parts of the Tales of Hoffmann, but to no avail. His frustration built and built. So one year, he wrote a letter to the meeting of the Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, demanding that they let him film. And according to Rehberg, they wrote back to him with the response, quote, "Let Tarkovsky film." So his deepest wish was granted, and he made Stalker. And I think we can read the film as a political allegory too, as a condemnation of the corrupting power of systems and their compulsion to create zones of exclusion, and the poor individuals who find themselves within them. And as Tarkovsky was developing Stalker, he was also working on a staging of Hamlet in Moscow. In one interview, he says,
Я бы так сказал, что драма, трагедия Шекспира и, в частности, трагедия Гамлета заключается вовсе не в том, что он гибнет физически в результате там, я не знаю, там одержимости чувством мести или чувством справедливости. Вовсе не в этом дело. А дело в том, что он обрекает себя на смерть, вот занимаясь тем, что собираясь справлять вот этот вывихнутый век.
And one can't help but feel that Tarkovsky too starts to come apart as he sets out to write his own Crooked Age. The film's first cinematographer, Georgi Rehberg, also saw the film as fundamentally concerned with the politics of a repressive regime, but one which cloaked itself in the trappings of genre to escape the Soviet censors. But this was also a cinematographer who professed to make his own films alongside those of the directors, and who was controversially fired off the film by Tarkovsky in contested circumstances. Tarkovsky himself rejected a reading of the film as a political allegory in a Q&A after the film aired in Edinburgh in 1981. Continuing his long argument with Rehberg, he said, "I am reduced to a state of fury and despair by such questions. The zone doesn't symbolise anything, any more than anything else does in my films. The zone is the zone, it's life, and as he makes his way across it, a man may break down or he may come through." As another commentator points out, the zone is more than just a zone, and Tarkovsky himself admits later that it is a kind of test. But interestingly, in the same Q&A session, Tarkovsky also rejected that the film was impenetrably mysterious or religious too. He clearly wanted the film to stand on its own in multiple interpretations, not mysterious, but ambiguous. After all, it's the task of the audience, and not the director, to enter the zone and see what they find there. Well, here's what I found, because predictably, I've lied to you. Just a little bit, I promise, and for dramatic purposes. The truth is that there aren't just three readings or interpretations of this deeply philosophical film. Of course there isn't. As we know, even the simplest texts can have multiple and contested readings. Just ask Derrida. But for me, predictably, the film Stalker is about the task of philosophy. Because philosophy is like the zone. It begins where our other means of explanation, like science or literature or politics or economics, end. Where they break down and they find anomalies like those sheltered by the zone. Thomas Kuhn argued that there are paradigms in science that break down and result in scientific revolutions. The task that carries us from one paradigm to another is philosophy. Because when we have competing interpretations and when we stumble around blindly trying to make sense or meaning of a film, underneath it all, there are the structures and the tools of philosophy to help us. And making your way through the zone is like the intellectual work of putting together a philosophical approach. There are dead ends like solipsism or analytic philosophy, shots fired. And there are meat grinders like small debates that spiral out of control and consume the careers of some philosophers. They know who they are. Then there are the utopias and the worlds you secretly wish for, like Marx did. And then there's the constant debate between the characters of this adventure, the logical, the passionate, the literary, the spiritual, or if you like, the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. In some respects, the task of philosophy is doomed from the start, but we philosophers still make the pilgrimage back into the zone. People often say to me, what progress has been made in philosophy? Why haven't you agreed? Why haven't you solved these problems? But what they don't understand when they ask that is, that's not how the zone works. When a problem is settled, or at least when it seems to have a useful solution, it's handed over to another discipline. The ancient Greeks' philosophical musings on atoms and on the substrate of the universe has been handed over to science. when it's mature enough. Questions about what justice is and what the law should be has been handed over to jurisprudence when it's developed enough. Adam Smith's philosophical treatise on the wealth of nations, which is a deceptively philosophical work that actually concerns itself with moral philosophy, is handed over to economics when it is advanced enough, and so on and so on. Because the great virtue of philosophy is that its questions are never answered. The terrain is always changing, and our path through it is altered from one journey or one generation to the next. This is because it doesn't just address itself to the terrain of the zone, but also the ever-changing forces that flow through it. And highly tentative answers, as we can sometimes see, can be very dangerous. But what happens when we encounter something inexplicable that by its very existence breaks the other answers or systems of thought? Well, that's when we turn back to philosophy. Philosophy doesn't make progress as such, and that's not really its place. It's much more like the zone, constantly throwing up ideas and paradoxes and thought experiments that might be carried out by brave adventurers to the outside world and potentially revolutionize other fields. But then, when that happens, the truth carried forth stops being a part of the zone. And it works the other way too. When we get too certain and too settled in the outside world, when we think we have everything worked out, a quick trip back to the zone reminds us that perhaps this is not the nature of things, that forms of knowledge or institutions or politics can undergo revolutions, and that then we are back in the unsettled, uncertain terrain of the zone and of philosophy, and of what we most deeply desire at the end of our quest. Because us philosophers, we're all like stalkers of one sort or another. And that's why I love this film. And you can adventure into the zone too. Because the only way to find out and to know is to experience the zone for yourself. And that's it for now. Sorry, it has been a long one. And yet, we've only just scratched the surface of the most philosophical film ever made, Andrei Tarkovsky's Stalker. Tarkovsky once said that he hoped his films will be received as a healing medicine. That's absolutely the case for me, and I hope it is for you too. Sometimes we just need a trip to behold the wonders of the zone. But for now, that's it for Philosophical Film Club. It's been a long journey, this one, but I hope you've brought something back to the world outside the zone. And until next time, be wise and be kind, and remember to pat a good boy.